We spent time talking about the Caribbean plantations, the Spanish and to a lesser degree the Portuguese getting a head start and making all kinds of money from selling sugar, how later the French and the English, and to a lesser degree the Dutch, got involved. But of course, in order to run these sugar plantations, they needed slave labor. And so we looked then a little bit at, the methods, what the Europeans did, and how they obtained their slaves, and the horrendous journey that they experienced on their way from Africa to the Americas. And, we will look at it again in a future chapter. But now we kind of shift areas and we move to Asia, okay? Because obviously the Americas isn't the only place where Europeans are establishing colonies and engaging in trade. In fact, it all started because the Portuguese and the Spanish were looking for a way to get to Asia. And of course, just like in the Americas, the Portuguese and the Spanish have 100-year or so head start. So it isn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that the English and the Dutch predominantly. The French are focusing on Canada, and remember, they were able to take over Haiti, which made them more money than every other sugar colony combined. So they weren't pushing too hard in Asia until a couple years later. So initially it's the English and the Dutch. And so we'll look at the Dutch first, okay? They begin to trade in Southeast Asia, and similar to what the English do, okay? The Dutch begin to form trading companies or charter companies, which in this case, they form probably the biggest one out of what the English did, the French did, the Spanish did. The biggest one out there eventually becomes the Dutch East India Company, okay? They were able to get multiple, and dozens of investors to pool all of their resources together, all in the hope of making money by trading in Asia. At its height, at its most influential, the Dutch East India Company had over 250 ships and over 12,000 employees, okay? The Netherlands is a little teeny tiny country, all right? So this is significant, all right? And like I said, compared to England and France and, the other European countries, it was huge. And they still had like a bigger presence than they did, okay? Now, predominantly what the Dutch traded in, okay, in Asia, number one, the obvious, spices. Okay, it's the thing that everyone went for. It wasn't just sugar that made, food yummy. You add some vanilla, some nutmeg, and you get a nice pumpkin spice latte. All right. So yes, bless you. All kinds of spices to make food taste better. I don't know where I'd be without the discovery of coffee. They discover coffee in Asia. That's where. Okay, people will debate, but that's where, it's one of the origins, okay? Some people say Africa, some people say the Middle East, and yeah, they also had it, but people don't start going crazy for it until they get Asian coffee, okay? So that becomes a big thing. And then, of course, they also discover tea, okay? Tea becomes a thing because of the Dutch. They bring it to Europe. And, a lot of Europeans begin to drink tea because of this. Plus, now you have sugar that you can add to your coffee and your tea. All right? You have nutmeg and vanilla that you can add to your coffee. So, yeah, it all just kind of starts to snowball from that. Now, obviously, these aren't the only things they're trading in, but this is the predominant stuff. Okay? Now, remember that the Dutch were typically only interested in making money. They were kind of like the Portuguese. Okay? But unlike the Portuguese, they weren't willing to just establish an outpost and let someone else do stuff while they traded. Okay? They wanted to kind of control the entire process. All right? So they weren't colonizing because, oh, we really want to spread Dutch culture to the whole world. They were colonizing because they wanted to control, all right, the beginning and the end of the whole process. That's what they did in New Netherlands. And so that is what they start doing in Asia, okay? We call this a monopoly, all right? They wanted to have a monopoly on the various products that they were bringing. Once again, they didn't want to negotiate with a local, all right? They replaced the local with a Dutch person, and then now, okay, they're in control. And so, one example of this is the island of Jakarta. In 1619, what the Dutch do is they invade Jakarta. They literally massacre everyone. They get rid of all of the natives, all of the locals. And once they do that, number one, they bring in Dutch farmers, okay, to work the land. Now, what the Dutch did is they separated their areas into different zones. And in this case, they would be like, before thank you, Jay, for being our native, would be trading, coffee and bananas and fruits and spices and different things. But what they would do is they would, once they got rid of all of the locals, they would get rid of all the stuff, and this area we're only going to dedicate to vanilla. This area we're only going to dedicate to sugar. This area we're only going to dedicate to whatever. And so in Jakarta, once they got rid of everyone, the only thing they planted in Jakarta was nutmeg. Okay, and that's where they got all their nutmeg. Okay, you want cinnamon, you got to go to the other island because that island is the cinnamon island. Okay, as opposed to having multiple crops. Okay, the Dutch felt that by doing this, then they really controlled, all right, the entire process. Of course, they're just kind of setting themselves up because if you put everything in one island, if there's like a nutmeg disease, I don't know, there goes all your nutmeg, in one shot. Okay, but this is what the Dutch begin to do. So, kind of like the Portuguese, is they only wanted money, but unlike the Portuguese, they weren't willing to allow the locals to do the work. They wanted to control the entire process. Okay? All right. Now, this is technically still Asia. All right, so we're going to look at the Ottomans, okay? Because remember, the reason why we started this whole Europeans going out into different parts and, Portuguese around Africa, Spanish, west to hit east, all of that stuff, is because the Ottomans had taken over Constantinople and they had a monopoly on most of the trade. Okay? Remember that during the 16 and 1700s, the Earth experiences a mini ice age. Okay? The worst of it from the 1700s to the early 1800s. We may not think of it as like, it's the Mediterranean, it's warm, it's balmy. But the water got so cold a particular couple of winters that people could walk across the Bosphorus, which is, there's a little narrow bit of water between, today it's Istanbul. Part of the city is on the west side in Europe. Part of the city is on the east side in Asia. It got so cold in the winters that the water froze and people could walk across. Okay, yesterday was pretty cold. Imagine like 100 years of that type of thing. Okay, now of course with lower temperatures means crops are freezing and failing, the growing season is significantly shorter. And so just like, more food, more people, bigger population, less food, well, people begin to starve. And so people begin to die off, number one. Okay. Number two, by this point in time, okay, if you recall at the very beginning of the chapter, we talked about how the various treasure from America was raising prices in Europe, okay? When there's more money in circulation, okay, prices go up because the people that have the money can afford to pay whatever price. But of course, the people that don't have the money, for them, it just gets much more difficult to survive. And once again, on my little soapbox, we're seeing that right now. Okay, people with money can afford the higher prices. The rest of us, tend to be struggling a little bit more. Now, the Ottoman Empire, they've taken a hit because, the Spanish have discovered different routes. The Portuguese discovered different routes to Asia. The English and the Dutch have different routes to Asia. So they're not making as much money as before. And now treasure from the Americas is making prices rise. So economically, the Ottoman Empire is suffering. Oh, by the way, it's really cold, and so there's not enough food to eat too. Okay? On top of that, okay, the Ottoman army isn't quite what it used to be, number one. The Habsburgs, they've grown in power, and so the Ottomans did, control a good part of Europe. They made it all the way into Hungary, but that's where they stopped. That's where they have been held back. In addition, in other areas like Africa and the Middle East, they're being pushed back by other Muslim countries, okay? So the Ottomans are limited in the space that they have, all right? So they're facing all sorts of problems. This is just a map that I found that actually shows where today modern-day Istanbul covers both sides, and so all of this got frozen over, okay, during the 1700s, not the entire time, but during the winters. That would actually freeze over. That's how cold the temperatures were back then. Okay, this shows the Ottoman Empire at its height, at its most powerful. So obviously now we're looking at a time where little by little, okay, Austria is going to start pushing back, all right, and the Ottomans are going to start losing land in Europe. Eventually, they're just going to have like little bit right here, okay? And the Austrians are going to control most of Southeast Europe. Little by little, the Ottomans are going to start losing their land in Africa and especially Egypt. And of course, they're going to get pushed back and out of Arabia by different Muslim powers as well, okay? So it's basically the beginning of the end, okay? Not the end yet. Remember, they survived until 1919. Okay, but it's the beginning of a very long and slow downhill ride. Okay, now, obviously, okay, people are desperate. Okay, not enough food. What food products there are crazy expensive because of inflation. All right, we can't expand any farther. Okay. And so what begins to happen is that people look at Europe and they're like, the people in Europe are like making mad money, all of this gold and silver that they're getting from America. And so Ottoman merchants going against, what the Sultan has established, basically begin to deal in the black market. They begin to sell goods to Europeans illegally. Okay, you sneak things across, you sell it to a European merchant, and then I keep the money. I don't report it because otherwise, like, I'm going to have to pay taxes, or the Sultan is going to, like, arrest me and confiscate all my stuff. All right, so various merchants begin to trade with different Europeans illegally. Okay, well, what does this mean? The Ottoman Empire is already suffering, and so without this tax revenue from these illegal sales, the Ottoman government begins to, collapse even more. They begin to lose more power. Okay, between 1550 and 1650, prices on goods. Now I know it's over a 100-year period, but still, all right, prices almost tripled. Okay, so that eventually we begin to see revolts and uprisings throughout the Ottoman Empire. All right, that tends to happen when people don't have food and people don't have money to buy life's necessities. People begin to rebel. Okay, the French find out in about 300 years. Okay, now what begins to happen though, okay, is a group of Muslims known as Mamluks. They begin to rise to power in Egypt. All right, Egypt historically has always been the most prosperous area, no matter who controlled it. When it was Egypt on its own, when it was part of Alexander the Great's empire, when it was part of the Roman Empire, when it was part of, the Ottoman Empire, it was always able to provide food. It was always able to provide the things that, everyone needed. Okay. So obviously the Ottomans can't afford to lose control in Egypt, okay? So the Sultan realizes that we need to do something, okay? And so there are some economic changes, okay? The Ottoman government, takes different measures to stop inflation, all right? They begin to allow more and more European influence, so that, the negotiations and the trades that Ottoman merchants are making aren't illegal. Okay, so even if we only get a little bit of tax revenue, that's more than enough. Okay, one of the things that they try to do, okay, and this works. Their economic reforms work. What they also try to do is, they are starting to lose land in Europe. And so the Ottomans make one last push to Vienna. They figure if we can conquer Austria and get rid of the Habsburgs, we could probably conquer parts of Europe, and, there's gold, that they're getting from America, there's silver. We can probably get a good supply there. Well, turns out that the Habsburgs and the Austrians are able to defeat the Ottomans, and the Ottomans never gain momentum again. Over the next 150 years, they pretty much lose every European land that they had, and in turn, the Habsburgs and the Austrians become one of the most powerful and influential groups in Central Europe. Okay, so, it spells the end of the Ottomans in Europe, but the rise in power of the Austrians. Okay, now, we're going to move away from them, going over to Asia a bit more, to Central Asia, okay? Most of you got this right. Remember, the Mughals are basically Indian Muslims, okay? The government is Muslim, but most of the people that live in India are still Hindu, and to a lesser degree, Buddhist, okay? Now, also remember, and those of you that have been with me since History 101, okay, India has never been united, okay? When the original groups came in, when the Aryans settled, unlike other areas, they had different kingdoms all throughout India. They came pretty close, like there was parts in the south and parts in the east, but they never truly united India. Okay, by the 1600s, though, okay, the Mughals are pretty much in control of most. There's like the little southern tip of India is outside of their control, and back then, what today is called Sri Lanka was considered part of India. they're not in control of that either. Okay? Now, with this control, of course, not every Indian was happy to be a part of this Muslim government, because most of them had been conquered, and so we begin to see small uprisings, okay, against the Mughal government. It is at this point in time that Europeans show up. Okay, they always show up right when there's social problems. Okay, now when the Portuguese show up, remember, they just want to trade. At first, the Mughals don't want to do it, but they're scared of the cannon, they're threatened by it, so they allow the Portuguese to establish, outposts. And as I said, the Portuguese were happy to allow the locals to handle most of the work. As long as they had a place to trade, buy and sell, they were fine. Okay? Fast forward about 150 years, okay, and the English show up. Okay? Now, similar to what the Dutch did, okay, the English create the East India Company, and they're the ones that arrive with, ships and goods, and they want to trade with the locals. Okay? Now, at first, the English are content with just showing up and establishing, like the Portuguese, trading outposts. What the English were really interested in, though, okay, and this is probably one of the reasons why the Mughals allowed them, okay, is they were more interested in the textiles, okay? If you recall, or hopefully you recall, way back, the Indians were one of the first people to grow cotton, okay? And so they had, a couple thousand years experience in growing cotton and refining it. And so when the British show up and are like, hey, what is this pretty cool, airy, light clothing? All right? And so the English are like, hey, we want to buy it, okay? Yeah, I know spices and all that, but we got other places where we can get that. Plus, we're growing some sugar in Jamaica, and we've got other crops growing in America, but we could really use the cotton, okay? And so, the English are content for now, all right? And of course, while this is happening, like I said, the Mughals are slowly losing control of India, either through uprisings, rebellions, bandits, the laws breaking down, because once again, not every Indian is happy being under the control of a Muslim government. All right? Now, over time, okay, each of the local areas becomes semi-autonomous. All right? The local rulers are the ones that call the shots. All right? Okay, yeah, all right, the Raja in Delhi, okay, yeah, we pledge loyalty to him, but we really don't listen to anything he says, okay? Yeah, he's our leader, but, we do basically what we want, okay? And so, similar to what we see in the Ottoman Empire, okay, each region, because once again, remember, throughout history, Indians weren't really united unless they were forced to come together by some outside power. And so each individual region begins to negotiate with whatever Europeans are there. So, some groups negotiate with the English, some groups start negotiating with the Portuguese. Eventually the Dutch arrive, so they start negotiating with the Dutch. The French arrive, so they start negotiating with the French. And so India becomes split into these areas of control by Europeans more than, they are unified. And so eventually, okay, the Indians begin to understand how trading companies work. All right, the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and so on. And so the Indians create their own trading companies. All right, so they learned the business ropes pretty quickly from the Europeans that were there. okay? And so instead of the central authority being in charge of trade and negotiating with the different European powers, sorry, Morgan, it's Morgan, the Raja of, Delhi, dealing with the English, and Emma, the Raja of Mumbai, dealing with the Portuguese, and Jade, the Raja of Bengali, dealing with the French, okay? And so they're each dealing on their own and keeping most of the profits. Now, of course, the head Mughals know what's going on, but they don't have power to stop it. All right, and so each of these, bless you, individual Rajas, okay, fine, we'll pay lip service, we are loyal to you, here's a little bit of tax money, but for the most part, they're keeping it for themselves, okay? So not only has the central authority lost control, but now they're losing financial control over India, and this map is just, eventually you begin to get different groups coming in, and depending on which area of India you land in, depends on who you're going to negotiate. Okay? So little by little, Mughal power is diminishing. Okay? China now. Okay? We see the end of the Ming Dynasty. Remember, it was the Mings that got rid of paper money, which was a Chinese thing. It was the Mings that switched everything over to silver, which is what allows, outsiders to come in because Europeans are paying silver for all of the stuff. And so the Mings are like, hey, bring the silver, okay? But by this point in time, the Ming Dynasty is on its last legs, okay? Remember, it was the Ming Dynasty that built the city of Beijing, and they built it in a way so that you have the general population, you have the ruling class, and then in the center you have the Forbidden City, where the emperor and his closest advisors live. By this point in history, the emperors never leave the Forbidden City, okay? They have no clue what is going on outside of these inner walls, okay? And so, the very last Ming emperor has never left in his whole life. He is surrounded by 20,000 eunuchs who are his servants and his, ambassadors. Why eunuchs? Because he has 3,000 women. Can't trust those guys, all right? All those women are for the emperor, okay? He does not care about anything other than he's got 3,000 women he's got to take care of, okay? That's it, all right? So by this point in time, most of the governing is being done by other officials, okay? And most of them are only serving their own interest, okay? And so we have various things happening, okay? Number one, and we'll talk about Japan in a minute, but Japanese pirates are attacking the coasts, okay? So, the countryside is being ravaged, okay? Just like in Europe, just like in the Ottoman Empire, okay? All of the silver that Europeans are bringing leads to inflation because, once again, the merchants, the wealthy, can afford higher prices, but the lower classes, the peasants, they're not the ones getting silver, so they can't afford anything, okay? So we're seeing this phenomenon also in China, okay? Now, whenever there's a decrease or whenever there's, in this case, we're going to see a change, then yes, prices fluctuate and, there's shortages, okay? But in the end, whether prices go up, whether prices go down, whether there's a lot, whether there's a little, it's always the lower class that suffers, okay? The wealthy people manage to ride it out, okay? Add to that, it was a global thing. It wasn't just in Europe. It wasn't just in the Ottoman Empire. The lowering of temperatures was a worldwide thing, okay? And so China is affected in a similar way. The growing season is shorter, okay? So there are fewer crops. The crops that are there, the prices are rising, okay? Even more so when there's, where are you? When there's inflation, okay? So once again, it's the lower classes, it's the peasant class that is suffering, okay? We kind of see that today, not just with the money, not just with like the inflation bit, but eggs, all right? Have you seen the prices? Okay. First there was inflation, which made everything go up, and then now we have, I don't want to say it's an environmental disaster, but there is, bird flu going around, so a lot of chickens have died. So fewer chickens means fewer eggs, which were expensive already because of inflation, and now that just drives the prices even higher.
You know how bad it is? The Bangkok and over 4 days a year. That's how bad it is.
Yeah. No, it's bad. Okay. And I don't care about your politics. Okay, whatever. No. Inflation drove the prices up. The disease has driven the prices even higher. Okay. Because now there's fewer product. Well, here's what happens in China. So the people begin to rebel, and this last emperor is removed. He's overthrown. Okay. Various outlaw armies form. We begin. Yes.
Sorry, back to the previous slide. Why was there a decrease in silver? Because you said there was an influx, but like, why did it decrease?
Because a lot of the people that were coming to China, when they see the instability, they go somewhere else to get some of the stuff. Okay. And then right now we're going to see a change in government. And so this government now says, no, we're going to go back to the old system before the Mings decided to change it up. Okay? And so we get various armies forming. Like, basically control falls apart. And you get different warlords then fighting for control. Okay? One of those warlords, okay, in 1644 is able to lead an army into Beijing, and he takes it over. Okay. The emperor, because he has lost, in order to save face, he hangs himself. All right, in shame. Okay. And with his suicide, the leader of the army, a man by the name of Li, becomes the new ruler of. He's in charge. Okay, but. Right? Not everyone accepts Li's position. Okay? Yeah, you captured Beijing. Yeah, because of you, the emperor hung himself, and so, but now we're really leaderless, and most of the other armies don't want to follow him. His is just one of dozens of armies. And so the imperial army, because the emperor has hung himself and many of the government officials have run away, they're left kind of leaderless as well. And so some of the high-ranking generals, okay, go to a group of people known as the Manchus. The Manchus live in what today is Manchuria, okay? Traditionally, Manchuria was never a part of China, okay? Today it is because of this, okay? The Manchurians decide to help the imperial army, okay? And they are able to recapture Beijing from General Li, okay? And so, with the Manchurians victorious, they are able then to defeat many of the other, warlords, many of the other armies. When enough of them are defeated, they are able to solidify control, and they become the Qin dynasty, okay? They are Manchurians, they're outsiders, okay? But they are now ruling over China, Okay, this is where we get the name China, all right, because they are the Qins. They rule from 1644 to 1911. These are the last rulers of China. Okay, in 1911, the last emperor is deposed by the Japanese, and then that leads us into the Japanese-Chinese War, which eventually leads into World War II. Okay, and then they don't have the more countries. All right, so basically this leads into the end, but also into modern China. Just as an FYI, there's a movie that came out when I was in high school called The Last Emperor that actually talks about, his name was Pu Yi, the last Chinese emperor, and how he essentially dies in the 1960s as just a simple gardener in Japan. But, he's born an emperor and dies in a very humble position. Did any of you guys ever watch that? I think I might, let you do it for bonus if you want to do like a movie review type of thing. So, and Daniel's like, I'm looking it up right now. Where's it streaming? It's called The Last Emperor. Anyways, but yeah, okay, they become what eventually is modern China. All right, now. When the Manchus take over, everything you see in yellow is what China is, okay, under the Mings, okay? The Manchus live in the brown, okay? So now that the Manchus have allied with the army and they have taken over Beijing, okay, the yellow and brown, all right, becomes then China, okay? Over the next 300 years, everything you see in green is what China conquers. And this is almost what modern China is today, okay? Once again, those of you that have been with me since History 101, we started with just a little society there and a little society there, okay? And so over the thousands of years, it turns into that. Okay? So yes, it is under the Manchus that it becomes what we think of China today. Okay? Now, I got ahead of myself. All right? Yes, they acquire new territories, like I said. Okay? They eventually conquer everything that becomes modern-day China. Because they were outsiders, okay, because they were in fact a minority, all right, they adapt to Chinese culture, okay, they, take on many of the Chinese ideas, all right. Now, one of the things that they really were like, hey, the Chinese totally got this right, okay, was the patriarchal system that the Chinese had, okay, which was a little different from what the Manchus, okay. In this case, number one, and these are some new things that they push, okay. Ladies, if your husband dies, okay, nobody ever thought it wrong that a woman would take a new husband. In fact, in many cultures, it's expected, ladies, that you would remarry, especially if you had children, because, someone needs to take care of you, someone needs to take care of your kids. But when the Manchus, come into power, they're like, no. Ladies, if you could remain single for the rest of your life, even after your husband dies, okay, you truly are, an honorable person. You will achieve, an honored ancestor. You'll become one with the universe, and you'll become one of the gods, and all this other stuff. Okay? So they really push that on women. All right? When your husband dies, that's it. You're done. All right? You don't go looking for husband number 2, even though in most cultures, perfectly acceptable. Okay? Women, okay, were once again pushed to serve their families. During the Ming Dynasty, more and more women had found certain freedoms and independence and had like their own farms and, helped their husbands in many of the stuff. In this case now it becomes no, all right? You go back to cook, clean, and babies. Okay, that's it. All right, that is your job as a woman. And so the Manchus, reinforced this patriarchal system. Okay, so what little progress women had made over the hundreds of years that the Mings were in charge gets all taken away. Okay, now the Manchus do come in and levy taxes on a lot of the people, especially on the peasants. Okay, especially on the poor people. And it seems to happen quite a bit where it's the poorest classes that pay the most, while the upper classes tend to get away with not paying very many taxes. And so because of this, we begin to see, starvation amongst the lower classes. But, and here's where we get to, the Columbian Exchange again. Because of two crops that had been brought in from the Americas by the Spanish, corn and sweet potatoes, which did not exist in Asia, until the Spanish brought them, most of the upper class got all of the rice and the millet and the sesame and everything else that the farmers grew. But because corn and potatoes did not take up that much land and they were fairly straightforward to grow, in Chinese culture during this time, eating corn and eating potatoes was considered poor people food, but that's how the peasants survived, by living off of corn and sweet potatoes. That would not have been there if, Columbus hadn't fucked up and made it to America, and then, crops began going from one place to the other, and, potatoes, and, the Spanish took it to Asia, and then they brought back spice and all of that stuff, Once again, that's why we don't celebrate Viking Day. Vikings didn't do that, all right? But, yeah, it basically saves the peasant population of China, being able to plant corn and sweet potatoes, Now, under the Qins, under the Manchus, they continued to trade with Europeans, all right? They developed what is called the Canton system, You had to pay money. You had to be a member of what they called a guild, Basically, you had to be authorized to trade with Europeans, If you weren't authorized, you couldn't do business, The only city where this could happen was the city of Canton, Outside of Canton, if you were caught, secret meeting with Morgan here, both of you would be executed, So, you had to have special permission, and you could only do it in the city of Canton, Now, this worked great for a long time, all right? The Qin dynasty was able to control the trade. They were able to bring in just the right amount of silver and other currencies, so everything kept balance. And so eventually, over time, things kind of stabilized, Because of this, the Qins begin to allow, number one, more people to trade with Europeans, so they start opening up the Canton system to other merchants, and they start opening up into other cities, In addition, let me back up. Once they established that, they kind of left the system on its own, I'm going to trust Jade as a guild member. She's going to deal with Europeans, and boom, they're going to pay the right taxes. I'm going to trust Emma, who's also a guild member, trade with Europeans, and Emma's going to pay taxes, and the whole system is set up, and boom, And so, the Manchus, the Qin dynasty, focuses then on expanding into the green area I showed you, expanding their influence. In the short term, it worked, China found itself again. In the long term, though, a little bit of corruption from Jade, a little bit of corruption from Emma, Not everything gets reported back to the government, all right? Because they're busy settling other parts of China, okay? And then, of course, Morgan over here begins to trade not in Canton, all right, but in some other cities with Europeans. And so little by little, when we fast forward about 200 years, by the 1800s, yeah, China's a mess, and they're pretty much at the mercy of Europeans, okay? But initially, the Canton system does work, and it does provide relief for the Chinese economy, and because, you know, of that, peasants don't have to eat corn and sweet potatoes anymore. They can go back to rice and other stuff, okay? I thought we'd have time for Japan, but we're going to save Japan for Wednesday. All right, guys? We will finish chapter, Japan I think is the last thing, or maybe